The sound of children's laughter echoed through the living room as Daniel and Grace wrapped their father's birthday gift with clumsy excitement. Torn tape stuck to their fingers, paper crumpled at the edges, but their eyes sparkled with anticipation. Evelyn sat across the room, watching them with a hollow smile. She had chosen the gift herself, a gold wristwatch, engraved on the back with the words, "For all the moments that matter." A cruel irony, she thought, since Martin seemed to have less and less time for them these days. She didn't say anything, though. To her children, their father was still a hero, and she would never be the one to break that illusion. But even as she helped Grace tie the final bow, her thoughts wandered to the faint lipstick stain she had scrubbed off Martin's shirt 2 nights ago, and the unfamiliar perfume that lingered on his suit. It was a scent she could no longer ignore, a fragrance that haunted her laundry room, clung to his collars, and mocked her every time she folded his clothes. Tonight, as her children fussed over the gift, Evelyn felt a simmering storm building in her chest. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a woman with questions, and soon Martin would give her answers. The gift box sat on the table, glittering under the lamp. To the children, it was a token of love. To Evelyn, it was something else entirely, the symbol of a family clinging to what little was left. And, in her heart, she knew it might be the last gift Martin would ever receive from them as a family. When Martin walked through the door that night, the children rushed to him, wrapping their small arms around his waist. He laughed heartily, lifting Grace off the ground, but his eyes slid past Evelyn like she was furniture. That smile, polished, charming, familiar, was the same one he wore in boardrooms and dinner parties. It was the smile that convinced strangers he was devoted, reliable, trustworthy. But Evelyn had learned to see beyond it. She noticed the tired slump of his shoulders, the faint cologne clashing with the detergent on his shirt, the quick glance at his buzzing phone before he tucked it deep into his pocket. His lies were stitched into his smile, and Evelyn was tired of pretending she couldn't see them. Dinner was a tense ritual. Daniel asked him about football practice. Grace told him about her drawing in art class, and Martin nodded distractedly, laughing at all the right places, playing the role of family man with the skill of an actor. Evelyn kept silent, spooning rice onto his plate, watching him chew, without really tasting his food. When he excused himself halfway through the meal to take a call, Evelyn followed him with her eyes as he slipped outside. Through the kitchen window, she saw the way he tilted his head, lowered his voice, and smiled, not the hollow smile he gave her, but the warm, eager smile of a man who belonged to someone else. In that moment, Evelyn didn't just feel betrayed. She felt erased. Here was a man who had once sworn to cherish her above all, now pouring his laughter, his energy, his life into someone she didn't even know by name. She put down her fork, clenched her fists beneath the table, and told herself, if he thinks I'll keep swallowing this, he doesn't know me at all. It arrived unexpectedly, a photo sent to her phone by Miriam, her oldest friend. Evelyn had been at the grocery store, her cart filled with milk and cereal, when the message buzzed in. She almost dropped her phone when she opened it. There was Martin, seated at a dimly lit restaurant, leaning in close to a woman whose hand rested intimately on his arm. The woman was beautiful, bold, and far too comfortable with him. Miriam's text read only, I thought you should know. Evelyn stared at the screen, her breath quickening, the shelves around her spinning slightly. Strangers brushed past her, but she was rooted to the spot, her fingers trembling. For years she had pushed away her suspicions, telling herself she was overthinking, that she had no proof. But now, proof stared back at her in high resolution. The smile on Martin's face wasn't fake. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of smile that spoke of secrets, of late-night whispers, of a passion Evelyn hadn't seen in him for years. Her chest tightened, as if someone had reached inside and wrung her heart. She wanted to scream, to hurl the phone to the floor, but instead, she pressed the screen off and slipped it into her bag. That evening, Evelyn moved through her house like a ghost. She cooked, she cleaned, she answered her children's questions, but she heard none of it. The photograph burned in her mind. Who was this woman? How long had it been going on? And worse, what did it mean for her children? Evelyn didn't yet know what she would do. But as she folded Grace's pajamas later that night, she whispered under her breath, "If you bring her near my children, Martin, I will end this charade in the way you least expect." It was Daniel who broke her heart first. He had always been observant, sharper than his years, and one evening as they cleared the dinner table he asked, "Mom, does Dad like being with us?" "Because he's never here anymore." His voice was flat, but his eyes searched hers with desperate hope. Evelyn froze, clutching a stack of plates, fighting back tears. "Of course your father loves you," she said, forcing her lips into a smile. But she knew he wasn't convinced. His eyes had already hardened in the way boys do when disappointment becomes familiar. Grace, too young to understand affairs but old enough to feel neglect, asked her mother questions that sliced even deeper. "Mommy," she whispered one night as Evelyn tucked her into bed, "does Daddy love that lady from the party more than us?" Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. Grace couldn't possibly know, but children had instincts sharper than adults. "What lady, Grace?" Evelyn asked gently. "The one he talks to on the phone sometimes. The one that makes him smile." Evelyn kissed her daughter's forehead and pulled her close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. Grace soon fell asleep, but Evelyn sat in the dark for hours, staring at the wall, knowing her children could already see the cracks their father thought he was hiding. Evelyn realized then that Martin's betrayal wasn't hers alone to bear. It was seeping into her children's lives, staining their innocence, reshaping their trust. And if she stayed silent much longer, Daniel and Grace would learn to accept this pain as normal. That, she decided, she could never allow. If Martin wanted to gamble with their family, she would make sure the children saw the truth, not to hurt them, but to show them their mother would not be anyone's fool. When Martin's 45th birthday approached, Evelyn poured herself into planning the grandest celebration of their marriage. To outsiders, it looked like the act of a devoted wife, booking a luxurious ballroom, ordering gourmet dishes, inviting everyone who mattered in Martin's world, colleagues, family, friends. But beneath her graceful smile was a blade waiting to strike. She had rehearsed her lines in the mirror at night, imagining the hush that would fall when she exposed him. She wouldn't cry, she wouldn't scream. She would slice through his pride with precision, using the very stage he thought belonged to him. On the morning of the party, Evelyn dressed Daniel and Grace in matching outfits, tying Grace's ribbons with careful hands. "Tonight is Daddy's big day," she told them softly, her eyes glinting with something they couldn't name. She wore a red dress that hugged her frame, not for Martin, but as armor, bright, bold, impossible to ignore. The kind of dress that demanded presence. The kind of dress worn by a woman who refused to fade into the shadows any longer. As she stood before the mirror one last time, Evelyn whispered to her reflection, "If he brings her, if he dares to bring her into this house of lies, I'll give him a birthday he will never forget." Then she slipped on her heels, gathered her children, and walked out the door with the calm determination of a woman ready for war. The ballroom shimmered with light, chandeliers scattering gold across polished floors, violins humming softly in the background. Guests mingled with glasses of champagne in hand, offering polite laughter and compliments about the decorations Evelyn had chosen with such meticulous care. She glided through the room, her red dress catching every eye, her children trailing proudly at her side. For a moment, she almost convinced herself she could endure this charade with dignity. But then, the doors swung open, and the air shifted. Martin walked in with his usual commanding presence, his smile wide, his suit immaculate, and clinging to his arm was the woman Evelyn had seen in the photograph. Tolu. Young, bold, beautiful, dripping in confidence, as though she owned the night. The murmurs began instantly, a ripple of whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Evelyn felt Daniel's hand tighten around hers, his small fingers trembling. Grace blinked up at her, confused, her innocent face clouded by something she couldn't quite name. Evelyn bent down and whispered, "Smile for Daddy," even though her own jaw felt as though it might crack from the effort. Martin approached with a casual arrogance, introducing Tolu to colleagues as his business partner, though the intimacy in their body language betrayed the truth. Evelyn's stomach clenched, but her eyes gleamed with icy calm. Let them whisper, let them watch. Tonight was no ordinary party. Tonight, Martin had handed her the weapon she needed on a silver platter. Across the room, Tolu caught Evelyn's gaze and smirked, as though mocking her. That smirk sealed Tolu's fate. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, her grip on her children firm, and thought, "You came into my home, my life, my family, parading yourself like a queen. But before this night is over, the crown you think you're wearing will be shattered in front of everyone you hope to impress." The children were the only ones in the room whose hearts didn't understand how to pretend. Daniel's face hardened as he watched his father lean down to whisper something into Tolu's ear, his fists clenching at his sides. He had always admired his father, had always defended him at school when other boys complained about their dads being absent. But now, watching Martin laugh with another woman while his mother stood nearby, Daniel's admiration cracked like glass. His chest burned with confusion, shame, and rage he was too young to process. He tugged at Evelyn's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, is she replacing you?" His voice was low, but the tremor in it nearly broke her. Grace, younger and softer, didn't understand betrayal in the same way, but she felt it sting just as sharply. She clutched Evelyn's hand, her wide eyes darting between her parents, sensing the wrongness even if she couldn't name it. She whispered in her mother's ear, "Why is Daddy holding her hand? Doesn't he hold yours?" Evelyn bent down, kissed her daughter's forehead, and forced a smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Daddy will learn something important tonight." Her voice was calm, but inside she was screaming. As the band played and guests filled the room with chatter, Evelyn's children stayed close to her, their eyes glued to their father and the woman on his arm. They weren't old enough to understand every detail, but they were old enough to see disrespect. And Evelyn, watching their little hearts begin to crack under the weight of their father's choices, knew she could not let this night end without tearing the mask off the man who had hurt them all. When the time came to cut the cake, the lights dimmed, and the band struck a cheerful tune. A massive three-tiered cake rolled in, glowing with candles. As the crowd cheered for Martin to make a wish, Evelyn stepped forward gracefully, her heels clicking against the floor, her children at her side. But instead of handing the microphone to her husband, she kept it in her own hand. The room quieted, expecting a sentimental speech about love and gratitude. Instead, Evelyn's smile sharpened like glass, her voice clear and cold as it cut through the noise. "Before Martin makes his wish tonight," she began, "I'd like us all to acknowledge the woman who has been keeping him very busy after office hours." The room fell silent. Gasps rose like a wave, spreading from table to table. Tolu froze, her smirk vanishing as her name hung unspoken in the air but known to all. Martin's face drained of color, his carefully crafted mask slipping as murmurs filled the space. Evelyn didn't tremble. She didn't shout. She stood tall, her voice calm and precise, every syllable dripping with truth. "Yes, this is Tolu," she continued, turning her gaze toward the mistress. "The woman my husband has chosen to share his time, his smiles, and his lies with. You've all seen them together tonight. Now you know exactly what she is to him." Guests shifted uncomfortably, some hiding their smirks, others staring wide-eyed. Evelyn let the silence stretch before walking straight up to Tolu. She handed her a broom the hotel staff had been using nearby. "Since you enjoy sweeping into other people's marriages, darling, why don't you start with this mess?" The audience erupted, some in laughter, some in shock, some unable to look at all. Tolu's face burned red as she dropped the broom and fled the room in tears. Martin stood paralyzed, his pride shattered, his reputation unraveling before his very eyes. Evelyn set the microphone down, kissed her children on their heads, and thought, "Happy birthday, Martin. I hope you like your gift." Tolu burst into the hallway outside the ballroom, mascara streaking down her cheeks, her heels clattering against the polished tiles. She had imagined this night as her moment of triumph, a grand unveiling, a silent declaration to the world that Martin was hers now. Instead, she had been stripped bare in front of hundreds, reduced to nothing more than a joke. The broom's weight still lingered on her hands like a brand of humiliation she could never wash away. She locked herself in a bathroom stall, sobbing, while outside the whispers multiplied like snakes. Her name would be on every tongue by morning, her face etched into every memory of scandal that night. Back inside, Martin's humiliation was no less complete. His colleagues stared, some shaking their heads in pity, others in smug delight at his downfall. His family avoided his gaze, their disappointment searing. Daniel refused to stand beside him, stepping closer to Evelyn instead. Grace clung to her mother's leg, refusing to even look at her father. Martin tried to speak, tried to regain control, but his throat was dry, his words failing him. Every attempt at dignity only made him look smaller, more pathetic. The birthday that was supposed to elevate him had become his public undoing. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a queen in command, her calmness making Martin's fumbling look worse. She greeted guests politely, thanking them for coming, as though nothing unusual had happened. People admired her composure, whispering words of respect for the woman who had turned humiliation into art. By the time the party fizzled into an awkward end, the roles had shifted. Evelyn was no longer the invisible wife, but the woman everyone admired. And Martin, once the center of admiration, was now nothing but a cautionary tale. When the last guest had left, silence swallowed the house. Evelyn tucked Grace into bed, stroking her hair until her sobs quieted. Daniel sat awake in his room, staring at the wall, his jaw clenched. He didn't say a word when Martin came to check on him. He simply rolled over, his silence louder than any scream. Evelyn walked through the darkened hallway, her heart breaking for her children, yet strangely steady in her own chest. She had done what needed to be done. There was no turning back now. In the living room, Martin exploded. "How could you humiliate me like that in front of everyone?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. His face was flushed, his hands trembling, not from guilt, but from rage at being exposed. Evelyn stood calmly by the doorway, her arms folded. "I didn't humiliate you, Martin," she said softly, almost pitying. "You humiliated yourself the day you chose her over your family. I just gave you a mirror." Her words sliced deeper than any scream could have. For a moment, Martin looked as though he might break, his lips parted, his eyes wild. But then pride wrapped around him like armor. He grabbed a suitcase from a closet, tossing clothes inside with shaking hands. "If you want me gone, fine. You'll regret this." Evelyn didn't move to stop him. She simply watched as her husband of 15 years packed his life into a bag and stormed out into the night. The door slammed behind him, leaving Evelyn standing in the silence of a house that felt emptier than ever. Upstairs, Daniel and Grace listened to the sound of their father leaving, their small hearts breaking, their innocence fading with every echo of his footsteps. The night Martin left, the air outside was damp with rain, the streetlights casting fractured shadows across the pavement. He drove with trembling hands on the wheel, the humiliation from the party replaying in his mind like a cruel film on endless loop. His wife's voice, calm and sharp, echoed louder than the thunder overhead. "I just gave you a mirror." Instead of reflecting on his betrayal, his wounded ego twisted her words into an attack. He convinced himself Evelyn had gone too far, that she had pushed him out, that she was the villain who had ruined what little remained of their marriage. In his mind, leaving wasn't cowardice, it was control. He told himself he would teach her a lesson, show her what life was like without him. At home, Daniel sat rigidly in bed, fists clenched, staring at the dark ceiling as the sound of his father's car faded away. Grace whimpered in her sleep, clutching her teddy bear as though she could hold onto a family that was already splintering. Evelyn, exhausted, sat in the kitchen with a cup of untouched tea, staring at the door Martin had slammed shut behind him. She didn't chase him. She didn't beg. The silence was her answer, her dignity intact, even as her heart cracked under the weight of 15 wasted years. Her children were broken, but she vowed then and there that she would not let Martin's pride poison them further. Meanwhile, Martin pulled up to Tolu's apartment, where she welcomed him with open arms, soothing his ego with sweet words and wine. She whispered that Evelyn had embarrassed herself more than him, that the guests admired his courage for walking out, that he was a man too powerful to be diminished by one scene. He believed her, drinking down her words like medicine. In that small apartment, he convinced himself he had made the right choice, that Tolu, young and adoring, was worth more than the wife who had dared to humiliate him. But deep inside, a sliver of doubt festered, whispering truths he wasn't ready to face. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's anger hardened into something cold and unyielding. He stopped answering Martin's calls, slamming his bedroom door whenever Evelyn mentioned his father's name. He poured himself into school and football practice, using exhaustion as a shield against the ache in his chest. For a boy of 12, the betrayal felt personal, almost adult. His father hadn't just left his mother, he had left him. Daniel no longer dreamed of being like his dad. He began to loathe the man who had once been his hero. His silence was louder than any scream, and it cut Martin deeper than Evelyn's public humiliation ever had. Grace, softer and more tender, still asked for her father at night. "When is Daddy coming back?" she whispered as Evelyn tucked her in. Evelyn would smile gently, stroking her daughter's hair, but her answers were vague. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that her father had chosen another woman over bedtime stories, soccer games, and Saturday pancakes? Grace's longing tore at Evelyn's heart, but she knew it was better than Daniel's rage. One child clung to hope, the other clung to resentment, and Evelyn had to carry both weights alone. Martin noticed the distance when he tried to visit. He arrived with gifts, with forced smiles, with promises he couldn't keep. Grace hugged him shyly, but Daniel stood in the corner, arms crossed, refusing to speak. "Don't bother," he muttered once, his voice low but sharp. "We don't need you." The words pierced Martin's chest, but instead of humbling him, they fueled his anger toward Evelyn. He told himself she had poisoned their children against him, feeding them lies. What he couldn't face was the truth, that Daniel and Grace had seen everything themselves, and they needed no one to tell them who their father really was. At first, life with Tolu seemed intoxicating. She was affectionate, playful, quick to soothe his bruised pride. She called him her king, told him he deserved better than a bitter wife who embarrassed him. But the shine began to wear off quickly. Tolu was not Evelyn. She didn't know how to balance his moods, how to manage his silences, how to hold a home together. She was demanding in ways Evelyn never was, insisting on dinners at expensive restaurants, trips that drained his wallet, jewelry that sparkled under every light. She wanted to be displayed, not hidden, and Martin, already struggling under whispers at work, felt the pressure tightening like a noose. The more Martin tried to appease her, the more Tolu pushed. She wanted him to make their relationship public, to divorce Evelyn officially, to give her what she called her rightful place. He resisted, knowing that would destroy what little was left of his reputation. He began to notice the shift in her tone, the subtle irritations when he came home late, the way she rolled her eyes when his phone buzzed with work calls, the sharp comments about how she deserved better than sneaking around. The woman who had once soothed his pride was now feeding on it, demanding more than he could give. At night, when he lay beside her, he sometimes thought of Evelyn, not with love, but with a grudging recognition of her strength. She had endured his moods, his neglect, his betrayals, and still held their family together. Tolu, by contrast, seemed like fire, bright, exciting, but dangerous, consuming everything in its path. He didn't say it aloud, but deep down, Martin began to feel what he dreaded most: regret. It began with a phone call Evelyn hadn't expected. A friend from Martin's office rang her late at night, her voice hushed and urgent. "Evelyn, be careful. There are recordings." At first, Evelyn didn't understand. But then she learned that Tolu had been keeping evidence, private conversations, financial secrets, even voice notes of Martin disparaging his colleagues and mocking his own family. She was threatening to release them unless Martin gave her what she wanted: money, status, and a promise to leave Evelyn permanently. The scandal, if exposed, could ruin him professionally and socially. When Evelyn confronted him about it, Martin lashed out, accusing her of prying, of delighting in his misery. But beneath his anger was panic. His once carefully curated image was unraveling, and the woman he had left his family for was tightening the rope around his neck. He begged Tolu to stop, to remember what they had, but she only laughed. "I didn't come here to play second wife, Martin. If you want me, prove it. If not, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Her voice dripped with venom, and Martin, for the first time, realized he wasn't in control. Evelyn, though wounded, felt no pity. Watching Martin squirm under Tolu's blackmail was almost poetic justice. He had traded a woman who shielded him for a woman who exposed him. He had gambled with his family, and now the stakes were higher than he ever imagined. Still, she worried, not for him, but for Daniel and Grace. They didn't deserve the storm about to hit. Evelyn knew one thing. No matter how ugly this became, she would shield her children from the fallout, even if Martin was too blind to do the same. The whispers at Martin's company grew louder with each passing week. Clients began to withdraw, uncomfortable with the scandal swirling around his name. Colleagues who once envied him now smirked behind his back, repeating Tolu's leaked snippets of private conversations. At first, Martin tried to fight it, insisting it was all lies, but the evidence was damning. His bosses grew cold, his projects were reassigned, and eventually, he was suspended pending further review. The career he had spent decades building collapsed overnight, leaving him grasping at nothing. At home, or rather in Tolu's apartment, he spiraled. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now drowned his nights in whiskey, his days in silence. Tolu grew restless, snapping at him for his failures, accusing him of dragging her down. She had wanted a man of power, not a disgraced husband. She began disappearing for nights at a time, her phone locked, her explanations vague. Martin suspected she was seeing someone else, but he was too broken to confront her. The irony was bitter. He had abandoned his wife and children for this woman, only to find himself abandoned in turn. Meanwhile, Evelyn carried on with quiet strength. She managed the children's routines, kept the house running, and held her head high in public. Neighbors whispered about her bravery, colleagues admired her composure, and friends rallied around her. The scandal that had destroyed Martin's career elevated Evelyn's dignity. She had not only survived the humiliation, she had emerged untouchable. And though her nights were still heavy with loneliness, she slept easier knowing her children were safe with her, not dragged into their father's chaos. The unraveling of Martin's new life came faster than he ever expected. Tolu, once his comfort and distraction, grew restless with the man who now reeked more of whiskey and regret than of power and ambition. She mocked him openly, telling her friends in hushed but careless tones that he was washed up, a man who had traded a loyal wife and children for nothing but shame. Martin overheard her one evening when she forgot to mute her phone during a video call. The words pierced deeper than any humiliation Evelyn had given him. He was no longer her king, no longer her prized man. He was a burden, a reminder of the scandal that had tainted her own name. The betrayal came to light when Martin returned to her apartment one night and found another man's jacket hanging over the back of the couch. The smell of cologne that wasn't his clung to the air, sharp and invasive. Tolu didn't even bother to explain. "I told you what I needed, Martin," she said coldly, her eyes glittering with cruelty. "A man who can give me the life I deserve. You're not that man anymore." She slammed the door behind her lover, as though dismissing Martin entirely. The room spun around him as he realized the depth of his mistake. He had destroyed his marriage, abandoned his children, burned his reputation, all for a woman who had never truly loved him. For the first time in years, Martin felt the hollow ache of being utterly alone. The anger that had once fueled him drained away, leaving only despair. He sat on the edge of Tolu's couch, his head in his hands, surrounded by the ghosts of his choices. He had given everything to his pride, and in return, it had stripped him of all that mattered. Martin's spiral into despair deepened. Nights blurred together, empty bottles littered the floor, and he began wandering the streets aimlessly, too ashamed to return to the home he had abandoned, too proud to beg for forgiveness. But the silence grew unbearable, and soon his loneliness turned into obsession. He started parking near Evelyn's house, watching from his car as the lights flicked on and off, as his children laughed through the open windows. The sound of their voices, once his greatest joy, now tortured him. He longed to walk in, to be greeted with Daniel's grin and Grace's hug, but he knew he was no longer welcome. One night, drunk and desperate, he stumbled to the front door and banged on it, shouting for Evelyn to let him in. Daniel rushed down the stairs, his face flushed with fury. "Go back to your mistress," he screamed, his voice cracking with the rage of betrayal. Grace sobbed behind her brother, clutching Evelyn's arm as though afraid her father might take her away. Evelyn stood firm, her face composed even as her children's cries ripped through the night. "Leave, Martin," she said quietly. "This is not your home anymore." He stood there, rain soaking his suit, his children's rejection heavier than the storm itself. For the first time, he realized they no longer saw him as their father, but as a stranger. When the door shut in his face, Martin staggered back to his car and wept. The image of Daniel's hard glare and Grace's trembling sobs haunted him. The pride that had driven him to walk out now lay shattered at his feet, but it was too late. He could not pick up what he had broken. The house that once echoed with his laughter was no longer his, and the family he had abandoned had built a life without him. While Martin sank deeper into despair, Evelyn rose like steel forged in fire. She focused on her children, filling their days with love and stability. Daniel thrived under her guidance, channeling his anger into football and academics, becoming a quiet protector for his younger sister. Grace, though still tender, blossomed with Evelyn's unwavering reassurance, her laughter slowly returning to the house. Evelyn was no longer just their mother. She was their anchor, their shield, their proof that love could survive betrayal. Her strength didn't go unnoticed. At work, she received a promotion, her colleagues admiring her poise in the face of public scandal. In the community, people whispered not with pity, but with respect. She became a symbol of resilience, the woman who had not only exposed a cheater, but had carried herself with dignity afterward. Invitations to events poured in, offers of friendship and support multiplied. Even quietly, a widower from the neighborhood began courting her, drawn not just to her beauty, but to her courage. Evelyn wasn't ready for romance, but the attention reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. She was still desirable, still alive, still worthy of love. At night, as she sat on the porch watching Daniel and Grace chase fireflies, Evelyn reflected on how far she had come. The humiliation that once threatened to destroy her had instead rebuilt her into someone stronger than she ever imagined. She didn't need Martin. She didn't need his validation. All she needed was the family she had chosen to protect, and the peace she had carved from the wreckage of betrayal. But even as Evelyn found her footing, Tolu wasn't done. Scorned and bitter, she launched a vicious smear campaign online, creating anonymous accounts to accuse Evelyn of being abusive, manipulative, even responsible for Martin's downfall. The lies spread quickly, feeding on the remnants of scandal. For a moment, Evelyn feared the gossip might stick, that her children might hear whispers at school and suffer again. But to her surprise, the community refused to believe Tolu's venom. People rallied behind Evelyn, dismissing Tolu's accusations as desperate attempts to stay relevant. Martin, watching from the shadows, realized how far he had fallen. The woman he had chosen over his family now used his own disgrace to fuel her hatred. And Evelyn, the wife he had humiliated, stood untarnished, supported by the very society that had once gossiped about her. He wanted to warn her, to protect her, to somehow reclaim the role of her defender, but he no longer had the right. His name carried only shame, while hers carried honor. The final blow came when Martin saw Tolu's new lover flaunted publicly on social media, a wealthy businessman who gave her everything she demanded. Tolu had moved on without a second thought, leaving Martin as nothing more than a cautionary tale. He was no longer her king, not even her fool. He was nothing, and that realization crushed him more than all his losses combined. The years that followed were unkind to Martin. Jobless, disgraced, and estranged from his children, he lived in a small rented flat, surviving on odd work and fading pride. He attended Daniel's football games from the shadows, never daring to approach, watching his son excel while pretending he didn't see the figure in the stands. He watched Grace blossom into a young woman, her laughter ringing across the field, her innocence restored by Evelyn's love. They were thriving without him, building a future in which he was little more than a ghost. The day of Daniel's graduation, Martin slipped quietly into the back row, his face lined with years of regret. He watched his son take the stage, tall and proud, delivering a speech about resilience and heroes. "My hero," Daniel said, his voice steady, "is my mother. She showed me what strength looks like." The audience erupted in applause, Evelyn's eyes glistening as she watched her son honor her. Martin sat hunched, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. His son hadn't even looked his way. His children's hero would never be him again. As Evelyn stood with Daniel and Grace, their arms wrapped around her, Martin realized the brutal truth. What he did next, the night of his birthday, when he chose pride and betrayal over love and family, was the moment that sealed his fate. He had thought he was teaching Evelyn a lesson. Instead, he had written his own downfall. And now, with nothing left but memories and regret, he finally understood. He hadn't lost his wife. He had lost his legacy. Please like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.